Number 1.
Aztec history is filled with tales of human sacrifice. And while the jury is out over just how often these bloody ceremonies occurred in Mesoamerica, the details of the grisly rituals are clear. A victim was laid upon a stone, where a high priest would slice open the abdomen, tear out the still-beating heart, and raise it as an offering to Huitzilopochtli, the deity of the sun. Fast forward a few millennia and you find a 20th-century high priestess of blood from Mexico. Her name was Magdalena Solis, and she sacrificed her followers as part of a dark quest for power. Solis was born into poverty in Monterrey, Mexico, sometime between 1930 and 1940. She became a prostitute early in life. Her pimp was none other than her brother, Eliezer. It's very possible Magdalena would have worked as a prostitute for her entire life, but once she met Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, everything changed. Santos and Cayetano were brothers and scam artists, working their way through Mexico in the early 60s. By late 1962, they reached the village of Yerba Buena with a scheme to dupe the local townspeople. The con was simple. The brothers told the villagers they were prophets of exiled Incan gods. They promised prosperity in return for unquestioning devotion. Of course, the Incan Empire flourished many miles south, in modern-day Peru. But the impoverished and illiterate villagers of Yerba Buena knew no better. They bought the story hook, line, and sinker. The conniving Hernandez brothers led their new followers into the nearby mountains, where they celebrated with forced orgies. Men and women were kept as sex slaves in caves, all in honor of the supposed gods. The con worked for a while. But the villagers grew impatient. They wanted to meet the wealthy deities for whom their sexual slavery was performed. So the Hernandez brothers traveled to Monterrey for help. There, they met the Solis siblings and quickly recruited them to pose as the long-awaited Incan gods. Together, the four scam artists traveled back to Yerba Buena and prepared a dramatic entrance. Once at the caves, the Hernandez brothers entered and began a ritual in worship of their gods. While the villagers' attention was diverted, Magdalena emerged from behind a smokescreen. The Hernandez brothers made a dramatic display of awe and claimed Magdalena was the reincarnation of a mysterious Incan goddess. The villagers were transfixed. This had to be true. And for the first time, the young poor prostitute from Monterrey felt the rush of absolute power. It wasn't long before she took over the cult completely, with Eliezer and the Hernandez brothers as her subordinate holy men. When two villagers attempted to leave, they were brought before the goddess. She sentenced them both to death. The defectors were lynched in full view of her terrified followers. Sacrifice, Magdalena learned, was an excellent way to maintain power. She established a blood ritual which was enforced whenever someone questioned her authority. Dissenters were beaten, maimed, and set on fire by believers. With the victim barely breathing, the bloodletting would begin. The blood was collected into a chalice and mixed with chicken blood, as well as marijuana rupate. The concoction was then presented to the goddess and her holy men. Magdalena told the cult that consuming human blood allowed her to live forever. It was the nectar of the gods. The grisly rituals continued for roughly 6 weeks. By the end, the leaders were dissecting the beating hearts of their freshly butchered victims. Magdalena proclaimed herself the reincarnation of Aztec goddess Coatlicue, mother of the sun, stars, and moon. In the spring of 1963, a local teen named Sebastian Guerrero happened upon the cult's caves. He watched in horror from behind a rock as they performed their blood rituals. The adolescent ran over 15 miles to the nearest police station. But authorities laughed off the boy's silly tale of vampires gulping blood in the mountains. Officer Luis Martinez agreed to escort young Guerrero back to Yerba Buena. On their way back, Guerrero convinced the officer to make one last visit to the caves. The pair was never seen alive again. When Martinez failed to return, authorities realized something terrible had happened. On May 31, 1963, police descended upon Yerba Buena with the Mexican army in tow. A heavy shootout commenced outside the caves. Multiple cult members were gunned down in the firefight, including Santos Hernandez. Magdalena and her brother were captured alive on a nearby farm. The bodies of Guerrero and Martinez were also found here. Martinez's heart had been torn out from his chest in the grisly sacrificial style of the Aztecs. Solis was sentenced to 50 years in prison for the deaths of Guerrero and Martinez. Authorities suspected her of killing many more, but surviving cult members refused to testify against her. It would be years before ex-members finally broke free from the spell of the high priestess of blood.
Number 2.
Events begin when 46-year-old pizza delivery man Brian Douglas Wells calmly walks into a PNC bank in town and demands that they give him $250,000. But what is particularly unusual about this robbery is that Wells, who is also carrying what appears to be a cane, has a large bulge underneath his t-shirt. He hands a note to the cashier demanding the money and states that the device around his neck is in fact a bomb. But the cashier tells him that they don't have that amount of money in the bank, and she instead hands him a bag containing just $8,702. Wells seems satisfied with this and leaves the bank, gets into his car and drives off. Everything about him is cool, calm and collected. Just a few minutes later he stops, gets out of his car, and collects what appears to be another note from underneath a rock. But soon the Pennsylvania state troopers are onto him and surround the car. They force Wells to the ground and proceed to handcuff his hands behind his back. Here the story takes an even more extraordinary twist. Wells begins to relate a bizarre tale to the police. Wells, who has no criminal record, tells the officers that he has been forced to carry out the robbery after being taken hostage by 3 black men whilst delivering a pizza to an address just a few miles from the Mamma Mia pizzeria where he worked. He says they held him at gunpoint, attached the bomb around his neck, and then instructed him to carry out the robbery. If he succeeds, he lives. But if he fails, the bomb will explode after 15 minutes. But something about this man doesn't quite add up. Despite his insistence to the officers that the bomb will explode at any moment, Wells seems completely at ease with the situation. Is the bomb actually real? Wells, it seems, may think that the bomb is a fake, but the truth is about to be revealed. At 3:18 p.m., the device starts to emit a loud bleeping noise, which grows steadily faster. It is at this point that Wells, for the first time, appears to become agitated. Just seconds later, the device explodes, killing Wells. Later, the FBI find a set of complex notes in Wells' car, which reveal that he had just 55 minutes to complete a series of tasks, including the bank robbery, before the device would explode. Upon the completion of each task, Wells was to be given more time before the device exploded. But what really happened here? This long and complicated story involved an even longer investigation, but ultimately Wells was, it transpires, in on the robbery. Wells, together with Kenneth Barnes, William Rothstein and Marjorie Deal Armstrong, had plotted to rob the bank. The purpose of the plot was to raise enough money to pay Barnes to kill Deal Armstrong's father so she could claim her inheritance. Barnes had drawn Wells into the plot, a man who he knew through prostitute Deal Armstrong. However, Wells' personal motivations for his involvement are still unknown. Rothstein died of natural causes in 2003 and as such was never charged. In September 2008, Barnes was sentenced to 45 years in prison for conspiring to rob a bank and for aiding in the plotting and execution of the crime. Due to bipolar disorder and a ruling that she was unfit to stand trial, Deal Armstrong was not sent down until February 2011. She was sentenced to life plus 30 years for armed bank robbery and using a destructive device in a crime.
Number 3.
48 years ago Wednesday, a bank robbery in Brooklyn, just one of several hundred bank robberies in New York City that year, turned into a 15-hour standoff with the FBI and NYPD. Played out before the media and a crowd of hundreds of onlookers, the bank robbery and hostage situation later became immortalized in the film Dog Day Afternoon. In his first television interview, former FBI agent James Murphy described to NBC4 New York his role in the prolonged standoff, which ended with his fatal shot at one of the bank robbers while surrounded by hostages inside an airport limousine. "I had obviously my wife and my child and the reality that I might die that night," Murphy said. "This situation was one that someone could die and that could be me." It was just before closing time on August 22, 1972, when John Wojtowicz and Sal Naturile entered the Chase Manhattan Bank on Avenue P in the Gravesend section of Brooklyn armed with a shotgun, a rifle and a handgun. The bank manager was able to surreptitiously alert his superiors in Manhattan that a robbery was in progress. Dozens of NYPD and FBI agents responded, trapping the robbers and their hostages, all bank employees, in the bank. Negotiations with Wojtowicz quickly turned into a circus-like atmosphere. At one point Wojtowicz called into radio stations explaining that he needed money to pay for a sex change operation for his gay lover. There was a point where Wojtowicz came out and threw money to the people, former FBI agent Murphy said. It was his way of taking control and making fun of everything. He probably came out 6 or 7 times. Following hours of negotiations, Wojtowicz demanded that he, Naturile and the hostages be driven to John F. Kennedy Airport for a flight out of the country. FBI agent Murphy was selected by Wojtowicz from a group of agents to be the driver of an airport limousine which had been provided. Wojtowicz searched Murphy for weapons. "As he's touching me looking for a weapon, and the crowd is cheering him on," Murphy said, "was the only time that I was really aware of the fact that there was a crowd there and I wasn't terribly comfortable of what was happening." Murphy had hidden his gun under the front floor mat of the car. As Murphy drove the limousine with the bank robbers and the hostages to the airport, Naturile had a shotgun pointed at Murphy's head. After the caravan of police cars escorting the limousine arrived at a secluded area at the airport, the robbers' request for food in the open limousine windows gave Murphy his opening. Murphy got out of the limousine and pretended to talk to other agents about food. In reality, they agreed on a signal which would cause the agents to initiate their plan to end the standoff. "You couldn't allow these hostages to get onto a plane with these individuals and go somewhere else," Murphy said. Murphy got back in the limousine, was able to reach his gun without being seen, and told the robbers that he may be able to get them some food. As Murphy spoke to the robbers, Naturile had the shotgun pointed at Murphy. Another FBI agent positioned himself alongside the limousine toward the rear. Seeing his opening, Murphy gave the signal. "In less than a second, I swerve, push the shotgun into the ceiling, which as I do that Sal goes up to hang on to it, and as he's hanging on to it, I take one shot and catch him in the chest," Murphy said. Simultaneously, the other agent reached through a window and grabbed Wojtowicz. After 15 hours, it was over. Later, a couple of the hostages expressed regret that Naturile had been killed. Murphy said, "The hostages and the hostage takers seemed to develop a Stockholm syndrome." Murphy remembers later going to see the 1975 movie with his wife. When Sal got shot, the audience booing. They were upset by the fact that he had been killed, he said. Wojtowicz served 14 years in prison and died of cancer in 2006. The partner he was trying to help by robbing the bank got a sex change operation and died in 1987.
Number 4.
For many years now, I've believed that what we call weird or unusual is, rather, the default position of the universe. What we think of as normality is a very rare and precious thing indeed. Strange, inexplicable things are thrown at us every day, but unless they seriously impact our lives, we are able to ignore them or explain them away to ourselves. There is, for example, the fate of a New York man named Donald Kemp, which ranks as the most bizarre missing persons case I've ever seen. His end was comprised of many smaller mysteries combined to cause one massive mystery. And he started out as such a perfectly ordinary guy. Kemp's life had appeared unusually fortunate. The 35-year-old ad executive was successful at his job, intelligent, well-liked, and prosperous. Still, he began to be unsatisfied with his lot. A bad case of the "is this all there is?" blues set in. After he became disabled from a 1976 auto accident, his 2-year period of recuperation intensified these feelings of restlessness into satisfaction. In September 1982, this normally ambitious, meticulous man abandoned his life and headed for Jackson, Wyoming. Kemp had long been fascinated by the Lincoln assassination, and he decided to pursue his dream of writing a book about the tragic event. During his convalescence, he believed he took mental voyages to the spirit world, where he was in touch with Mary Surratt, the woman hanged as a co-conspirator in Lincoln's murder. His book, he told friends, would combine Lincoln, spiritualism, and what he enigmatically described as the truth. "I have the truth," he once said. "The truth will come through me. I am attuned to a high spiritual plane. I am a messenger of God." On November 15, Kemp visited a museum in Cheyenne. He stayed for about 2 hours without speaking to anyone. After his departure, it was found that he had left behind his briefcase containing his diaries, address book, traveler's checks and his prescription eyeglasses. If Kemp was God's messenger, the communication he delivered was intensely odd. On November 16, 1982, when he was 2 days short of his destination, his van was found on an exit ramp in a deserted stretch of road in central Wyoming. The vehicle's motor was running, the radio was playing, and all the doors were open. It seemed like he had planned only a very brief stop. Instead, Don Kemp had vanished. A single set of footprints led from the van into the emptiness of the Wyoming prairie. While following this trail, searchers found Kemp's teapot. 4 miles away, 3 of his socks were found in an abandoned barn. A few days later, his laundry bag was discovered inside a haystack. There was, however, no body found or any other clue where Kemp went or, perhaps even more importantly, why he went. Rod Johnson, the deputy sheriff in charge of the search, was at a loss to say what had become of Kemp. "I don't think he's out there," Johnson sighed. "If he was, I would have found him. Kemp's mother Mary quit her job to devote all her time to finding her son. She was convinced that he had been kidnapped for whatever inexplicable reason and was still alive. "He didn't disappear into thin air," she said. "My son would not do this." A friend of Kemp's had a more pessimistic view. "I think poor Don was sitting on the fence of reality, and as he was driving down the highway, he finally crossed over to the other side of the fence. I think he saw some sign in the desert and walked off. There were signs that just before he vanished, Kemp's mind was going into some dark places." One friend received a phone call from him where Kemp was sobbing and near hysterical. When he stopped at motels, Kemp was fixated by movies with themes of disappearances. His final diary entry proclaimed himself to be an emancipator of men. A major blizzard hit the area several days after Kemp's disappearance, leading investigators to conclude the missing man was now certainly dead. No one, they concluded, could possibly have survived in that weather. This is when our story goes from merely mysterious to impossibly weird. 3 months after Kemp vanished, a friend of his named Judith Aiello returned to her New York home from a long vacation in Europe. Aiello had been out of the country for so long, she was unaware that Kemp was missing. She found a number of messages on her telephone answering machine from a voice that she swore was that of Donald Kemp. The messages were very brief, merely asking her to call him back. The voice left a phone number where he could be reached. When Aiello dialed this number, a man answered. She told investigators that when she asked him if Don Kemp was there, he said yes, no very quickly. When she said to tell Kemp that Judy called, the man simply said fine and hung up. This number was traced to a house trailer in Casper, Wyoming. Mark Dennis, the man who lived there, insisted that he had not made those phone calls. He vowed that he had never even heard of Kemp and certainly had no idea where he was. "It is bizarre," Dennis said. "It's puzzling. Nothing this strange has ever happened to me before. The only explanation I can think of is somebody got in my house to make the phone calls." As Aiello's number was unlisted, it could not be explained how Dennis, or any other stranger to Aiello, could have phoned her. Unsurprisingly, Dennis became the subject of intense interest to the police, but investigators could find no evidence whatsoever that he had anything to do with Kemp or his baffling disappearance. Adding to the eerie quality of the whole episode is that Dennis bore a startling resemblance to the missing man. Although Dennis was initially very cooperative with police, he eventually lawyered up and stopped talking. After Dennis was confronted by a very accusatory Mary Kemp, who refused to believe he did not know much more than he was willing to say, he quickly left town. It must be said that all this can easily be read as the actions of a perfectly innocent man, understandably frightened at finding himself mixed up in a particularly strange mystery. The phone calls to Aiello were not the only clues suggesting Kemp was still alive. Some people were certain that they saw him at an exhibit of Lincoln memorabilia held in Casper. Others believed they had spotted him in a Casper bar. However, hopes that the elusive ad executive had survived were dashed in 1986 when hunters found his badly decomposed remains just a few miles from where his van had been found. No sign of foul play was discovered, although it's hard to figure how that could be established after such a long period of time, leaving the authorities to conclude that Kemp voluntarily walked into the wild, where he probably died during the blizzard. A very tidy solution until you start thinking about those phone calls. If Kemp did not make these calls, who did and why? Why was Aiello the only person to get these cryptic messages? Is it possible that Kemp did make these calls? Was he, as some have theorized, kidnapped, only to be murdered by his abductors and dumped where he was found? This theory, outlandish as it may sound, would at least explain the puzzling fact that it took so long for his body to be found on that flat, open, barren terrain. In some of the wilder corners of the internet, it has even been suggested that his scholarly interest in the Lincoln assassination did him in. Did his research into the case lead him to stumble upon some great secret that forced shadowy powers that be into having him killed? Inevitably, others have proposed that the unfortunate man was kidnapped by space aliens. On a more prosaic level, Mary Kemp maintained the darkest suspicions about Mark Dennis. She went to her grave in 2014, believing that he had killed her son, although no one was ever able to explain why this seemingly normal man would murder someone who was a complete stranger to him. Speculate away. No matter how one looks at this case, it is damn difficult to find a normal answer for what happened to Donald Kemp.
Number 5.
Even if you're not a fan of detective novels, you are surely familiar with the locked room murder, that classic example of the genre. However, you might not necessarily know that this staple of fiction was inspired by one notorious true crime. The difference is, the real-life killing had no detective neatly wrapping things up in the last chapter. The first part of Joseph Bown Elwell's life was decidedly ordinary, even dull. He was born in New Jersey in 1876. After graduating from Andover, he worked as an insurance agent and a hardware salesman. He married Helen Derby in 1904. However, Elwell only found real success because he was one of the fortunate few who found a way of turning a beloved hobby into a career. Elwell had a passion for the fashionable new card game called bridge. He also discovered that he was an excellent player. He became a teacher of the game. Then, Elwell came out with a number of highly successful handbooks. Although his name was on the cover, they were actually written by his wife. He parlayed his love of gambling into profitable side careers, speculating on Wall Street and owning a string of racehorses. Before long, he was not only the world's leading bridge expert, he was an exceedingly wealthy man. He owned fine homes in New York, Palm Beach, and Saratoga, and moved in high society. Unfortunately for his marriage, Elwell's favorite socializing was with attractive women, and in a manner that went far beyond just playing cards. His womanizing became so open and frequent that his wife finally had enough and left him for her own house and her own life. Neither party was devastated by the separation. Elwell's life chugged along very pleasantly until June 10, 1920. That night, he dined at New York's Ritz with a small group of friends. Mr. and Mrs. Walter Lewison and Mrs. Lewison's sister, Viola Krause. Viola was in a celebratory mood. On that very morning, her divorce from Victor von Schlegel had been finalized. In fact, Victor and his fiancée, Emily Anderson, were dining at the next table in a similarly merry mood. If you believe the word of everyone involved, this was one of the most convivial divorces on record. After dining, the Elwell party moved on to see a show at the New Amsterdam. This lasted until about 2 a.m., when the group broke up and left for their own homes. The Bridge King was in notably high spirits that night. And why not? He had money, fame, and the inestimable good fortune of being able to monetize activities he loved. His play was his work. He must have seen himself as blessed. Elwell took a cab to his home on West 70th Street, stopping at a newsstand to buy a copy of the Morning Telegraph. Despite his late night out, he did not immediately go to bed. Phone records would show that Viola Krause phoned him soon after his return home. She later claimed it was over some unspecified triviality. Perhaps that was the case. At 4:30, Elwell phoned his stables in Far Rockaway, but got no answer. About an hour and a half later, he phoned a number in Garden City, New Jersey. We know no details about this call, other than that it was practically the last thing Joseph Elwell ever did. At 6:15, the milkman left his usual delivery at Elwell's door. He noticed nothing amiss. An hour later, the mailman left letters in the vestibule. He brought the bottles of milk in, as well. All was quiet at the Elwell residence until shortly after 8, when his housekeeper, Maria Larson, unlocked the front door and let herself in as usual. When she came in, she glanced into a small room near the front door and got the shock of her life when she saw a bald, pot-bellied, pajama-clad stranger sitting in a chair. It took her a few seconds to realize that this intruder was, in fact, her employer. Without the wig, corset, and dentures he always wore when he faced the world, he was almost unrecognizable. It later emerged that Elwell had no less than 40 wigs hidden away in his home. He had a prominent bullet hole in his forehead. Elwell was still alive, although unconscious. There was nothing anyone could do for him. He died shortly after being brought to the hospital. The how of the murder proved to be the one explicable part of this crime. Elwell had been found with his recently delivered mail by his chair. He had obviously come out of his bedroom sometime after 7:30 and collected his letters. He was reading one of them, an innocuous message from his Kentucky racing stables trainer, when someone shot him with a .45 automatic that had been manufactured for the U.S. Army. The weapon was never found. The killer had been only a couple of feet from his or her victim and, judging from the trajectory of the bullet, had fired in an upwards direction, either from the hip or from a crouching position. From the fact that Elwell allowed his visitor to see the real him, so to speak, it can be assumed that he or she was someone he knew very well, but that this person was not among his numerous lady friends. Elwell also trusted this person well enough to casually glance through his mail in their presence, feeling no hint of danger. He probably literally never saw his death coming. One would think these factors would considerably narrow down the number of people who could have shot Elwell, but the police seem to have been completely stymied from the start. Not only could no one think of any plausible reason for anyone to kill Elwell, no one could come up with any plausible suspect. Although he must have been shot just a short time before Mrs. Larson's arrival, no one on his very busy street saw anyone else enter or leave the house. All of Elwell's possessions, including $400 in cash, were untouched, suggesting that robbery was not a motive. Further complicating the puzzle is the fact that the housekeeper found the front doors locked. The rear and basement doors were also secured. The two keys to the house were in the possession of only Mrs. Larson and Elwell himself. The victim almost had to have willingly let his murderer into the residence. The investigation took an initially hopeful twist when police discovered that after Mrs. Larson discovered the wounded Elwell, she removed women's lingerie from her employer's closet and hid them in the basement. When confronted with her deception, the housekeeper muttered feebly that "I thought it would not be nice for them to be found there." She denied knowing who was in the habit of wearing this intimate apparel. However, again putting discretion over veracity, Mrs. Larson knew perfectly well who owned the lingerie. Viola Krause. It later emerged that after doing her little bit of crime scene tampering, the housekeeper phoned Krause to tell her of the shooting and assure her that the lingerie had been removed. This caused police to give another look at both Krause and her newly divorced husband, Victor von Schlegel, but unfortunately for investigators, both their alibis remained irritatingly watertight. In the near century since the murder, it cannot be said that the armchair detectives have made any further progress in solving the mystery. It has been suggested that Elwell actually shot himself and Mrs. Larson, who obviously wished to spare her boss any posthumous scandal, disposed of the gun, but that theory smacks too much of desperate reaching to be taken seriously. In his 1988 book about the case, The Slaying of Joseph Bown Elwell, Jonathan Goodman made what was, to date, the most exhaustive effort to explain the murder. He seized upon the fact that 2 years after Elwell died, Walter Lewison became violently insane and was institutionalized. What if, Goodman argued, Lewison, suffering from incipient madness, became irrationally jealous of Elwell over some joint female friend and either killed his imagined rival or had him killed? Goodman's theory is well argued, but too dependent on a chain of what-ifs to be ultimately convincing. On the other hand, there was the sweet simplicity of the conjecture offered by the lead investigator into the Elwell murder, Inspector Arthur Carey. He proposed that some common thief secretly followed the mailman into the vestibule in the hope of executing some quick robbery. He found the inner door ajar and made his way inside. When he unexpectedly came across Elwell, the burglar shot the man in a sudden panic and ran for it, shutting the door behind him. That scenario is just tiresomely mundane enough to possibly be the truth.
Number 6.
On January 2, 1935, at 1:20 p.m., a lone man checked into the President Hotel in downtown Kansas City. He had no luggage besides a comb and a toothbrush and asked for an interior room on a high floor of the hotel. He checked in under the name Roland T. Owen and complained to the bellboy about the outrageous prices of a neighboring hotel. After checking in and receiving his room 1046 on the 10th floor, he left the hotel, only to be seen intermittently throughout his stay. Though the man's behavior struck the President Hotel's staff as odd, they didn't think much of him. After all, the hotel often played host to out-of-towners and businessmen looking for some late-night company, and the less the staff got involved, the better. The staff wouldn't give his behavior another thought until 6 days later, when the man turned up dead, his hotel room a brutal bloodbath. As they described to police the brutal scene, questions arose about the man's behavior prior to his death, bringing to light just how strange that behavior had been. On January 3, one day after Owen checked into the hotel maid, Mary Soptic, stopped by to clean his room. It was around noon, and most of the hotel's residents were out for the day. However, upon reaching Owen's room, Soptic found the door to be locked from the inside. She knocked, and Owen opened the door. After insisting she could come back later, Soptic eventually entered. She found the room in almost complete darkness, with the shades tightly drawn and the only light coming from a small, dim table lamp. As she cleaned, Owen mentioned that he had a friend coming to visit him shortly and would she mind not locking the door. Soptic agreed, and Owen left the room. 4 hours later, Soptic returned to room 1046 with fresh towels. She found the door still unlocked from when she had cleaned the room that afternoon, and upon entering found Owen laying fully clothed on top of his still-made bed, seemingly asleep. A note on his bedside table read, "Dawn, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait." The next morning, January 4, Soptic's strange interactions with room 1046 continued. Around 10:30 a.m., she stopped by to make the beds and found Owen's door to be locked from the outside, as it would be when patrons left. Assuming Owen was not inside, she opened the door with her master key. To her surprise, Owen was sitting inside, in the dark, in the chair in the corner of the room. As she cleaned, the phone rang and Owen picked up. "No, Dawn, I don't want to eat. I am not hungry. I just had breakfast," he said. After a moment he repeated, "No. I am not hungry." After he hung up, Owen began interrogating Soptic about her job and the hotel, the first time he had ever really spoken to her. He asked her about how many rooms she was in charge of, what kind of people lived in the President Hotel, if any, and again complained about the price of the neighboring hotel. Soptic answered quickly, finished cleaning, and left Owen alone in room 1046. It was only after she left that she realized that since the door had been locked from the outside, someone had to have locked Owen in his room. Later that day, Soptic returned with fresh towels, having taken the ones from the room that morning. However, as she knocked this time, she heard two voices in the room, rather than just Owen. When she announced that she had fresh towels, a loud deep voice told her to leave, claiming that they had enough towels. Though she knew that she had removed all the towels from the room that morning, Soptic left the two men alone, not wishing to intrude on what was clearly a sensitive and private conversation. That same afternoon, the President Hotel got two more guests whose presence would contribute greatly to the mystery of what happened to Roland T. Owen in room 1046. The first was a Jean Owen, of no relation to Roland. She had come to Kansas City to meet her boyfriend for the day and decided that rather than drive all the way back to her hometown on the outskirts of the city, she would stay for the night in a hotel. Upon checking into the President Hotel, Jean Owen was given the key to room 1048, right next door to Roland. That night, according to police statements, she heard a repeated commotion. "I heard a lot of noise which sounded like it was on the same floor and consisted largely of men and women talking loudly and cursing," she said in her statement. "When the noise continued, I was about to call the desk clerk but decided not to." The other hotel guest was not quite a guest all. The bellop who had been on duty that night described her as a commercial woman who often frequented the rooms of the hotel's male patrons late at night. On the evening of January 4, she came into the hotel searching for a man in room 1026. However, despite being a very prompt customer, the woman couldn't seem to find the man she was looking for. After searching for well over an hour on multiple floors, she gave up and went home. Both of the women's statements would raise more questions about the fate of the man in room 1046. The next morning, the bellop received a call from the hotel's telephone operator. The phone in room 1046 had been off the hook for 10 minutes without anyone using it. The bellop went up to check on Owen and noticed that the door was locked with a "Do Not Disturb" sign hung on the doorknob. He knocked on the door and Owen told him to come in. However, when the bellop told Owen that the door was locked, he got no response. The bellop knocked once again, then yelled for Owen to hang up the phone, assuming Owen had simply been drunk and knocked it off the hook. However, an hour and a half later, the telephone operator called the bellop again. The phone in room 1046 was still off the hook and hadn't been hung up at all. This time, the bellop let himself into Owen's room with the master key. The man was lying naked on the bed, seemingly drunk. Not wishing to deal with him, the bellop simply straightened the phone, placed it back on the hook, and locked the door behind him, reporting Owen to his manager. To his surprise, an hour later the telephone operator called again. The phone was again off the hook, though not in use. This time, when the bellop opened the door, he found a bloodbath. Owen was sitting curled in the corner of the room, his head in his hands, suffering multiple stab wounds. The bedsheets and towels were stained with blood, and the walls were splattered with it. The bellop immediately called the police, who took Owen straight to the hospital, where doctors discovered that Owen had been tortured viciously. His arms, legs, and neck had been restrained by some kind of cord, and his chest sustained multiple stab wounds. He also suffered a punctured lung and a fractured skull. Roland T. Owen was pronounced dead at the hospital shortly after arriving. The doctors also discovered that the wounds on Owen had been inflicted well before the bellop's first trip to Owen's room that morning. They ascertained that he had attempted to call for help multiple times but hadn't been able to make it farther than picking up the phone due to his injuries. When investigators searched the room, the strangeness continued. There were no clothes in the room at all, and nothing matching the description of Roland Owen when he checked in. The hotel amenities such as soap and toothpaste were also missing, as well as anything that could have been the murder weapon. The only thing of note that detectives found were 4 small fingerprints on the telephone stand, though they were never identified. Furthermore, detectives found that Roland T. Owen never existed. There was no record of any such man having lived anywhere in the United States, and they implored the public to come forward with any information they had about the mysterious murder victim. Shortly thereafter, the neighboring hotel that Owen had complained so much about came forward, claiming that a man matching the description had stayed at the hotel on January 1. He had checked in under the name Eugene K. Scott. However, upon further investigation, the police reached the same dead end they had with Roland T. Owen. No man named Eugene K. Scott had any record of ever existing. Over the next couple of months, various people identified the body as a loved one, though none of the identifications stuck. Finally, the case ran cold, and the detectives decided to bury the body. As they arranged for a small funeral, a bouquet of flowers and a donation to cover the funeral costs showed up at the funeral home with a letter that read only, "Love forever, Lucille." A year later, a woman named Ogletree claimed that Owen Scott was her son who had been missing for years. She claimed his name was Artemis Ogletree and that he had been staying at another Kansas City area hotel at the time he went missing. Though there wasn't any more evidence to her case than any of the others, police were eventually inclined to believe her, though experts claimed it was only based on lack of evidence in the rest of the case. To this day, the case remains unsolved, opened yearly by the Kansas police as new pieces of evidence unfold. For the time being, however, it seems that the mystery of Room 1046 may never truly be solved.
Number 7.
Just a few days before Christmas, on December 23, 1933, a young woman dressed in a navy blue skirt and shoes with a white blouse and a floral print scarf draped casually around her neck was seen at the Greyhound bus station alone. Later she asked the ticket officer for travel and fare information to Erie, Pennsylvania, and Elmira, New York. She then asked about a ticket to Willoughby, which she purchased rather nervously. After she arrived in Willoughby, she is reported to have spoken with a local gentleman who offered her help, and with his guidance, she checked into a boarding house owned by Mrs. Mary Judd right in the downtown area. She did not leave a name when checking in. Mrs. Judd recalls her saying her name was Kate. After arriving at about 8 p.m. she went directly to her room to sleep. The next morning, she woke early and spent some time reading in the rest area before breakfast was served. During the breakfast, Mrs. Judd told her how to get to the main bus station, as well as the local church. After that, she headed down the front porch stairs and headed off toward downtown at about 11 a.m. 1 hour later, she returned to the boarding house, looking a little worried, and headed directly to her room. As she returned downstairs, her suitcase was clutched tightly to her side. Quickly she thanked the landlady for her hospitality, returned the key to her room and paid for her stay. The girl was seen 1 block south of the boarding house heading along a street that led her past the cemetery by a number of witnesses. They all said that she continued walking down the street until she reached the end. Then she purposefully stepped into the copse of maple trees and vanished from sight. Emerging the other side of the woods, she was faced with the railroad tracks stretching off into the distance. Suddenly, there was an eastbound flyer heading to New York barreling down the track at her doing about 65 miles per hour. She was seen to drop her suitcase, and then she sprinted toward the tracks. A glancing blow from the train sent her slight body hurtling through the air, landing on the gravel siding. Her short-lived life was tragically over. When her body was recovered by the local authorities a short while later, they were astonished to find no blood or visible wounds on the young woman. They carefully checked her body for identification and found none. Searching through her purse, they found coins, 90 cents, and a railroad ticket to Corey, Pa, a handkerchief, the usual trinkets and makeup a woman would carry, but no form of identification. After a search of surrounding brush, they found her leather suitcase. Inside, they recovered a towel, a few crudely sharpened pencils and some envelopes, but none of these things offered any clue to the girl's identity. The local authorities unable to discover her identity or the exact motives that had caused her to meet her death. Later they removed her body to the local funeral home of James McMahon. Upon his examination, Mr. McMahon concluded that she had died from injuries suffered during the train accidents. The exact cause of her death was listed as a fractured skull. He estimated her age at about 23. She was 5 feet, 4 inches tall, 135 pounds, with reddish-brown hair and hazel eyes. He noted that she had straight teeth, high cheekbones, and may have been born of foreign parents. Mr. McMahon decided to give her a proper funeral. Many people came to pay their last respects to the girl in blue, but no one seemed to know her identity. The story about her tragic demise began appearing in more and more newspapers, and families called from near and far desperate to find their missing loved ones, but she was never claimed. She was buried in a donated cemetery plot in the center of the middle section of the Willoughby burial ground, right under a towering pine tree. Hank Heaverly, the sexton of the cemetery, was raising funds to give her a proper headstone. A few days later, the local community responded, and a beautifully etched gravestone was erected with the following inscription: Girl in blue, killed by a train, December 24, 1933, unknown but not forgotten. Surprisingly, more than 3,000 local residents visited her funeral to pay their respects and see if they could identify her. In December 1993, her true identity was revealed when the News Herald published an article marking the anniversary of the girl in blue's death. The article was read by Pennsylvania real estate agent Ed Sekarak, who recognized the girl. He had been selling the Klimchak family farm in Spring Creek at the time. His report checked out, and it was discovered through court records that the mystery girl was Josephine Klimchak. Upon learning that Sekarak could confirm the identity of the girl in blue, Willoughby lawyer William C. Gargiulo came forward and asked that Lake County Probate Court Judge Fred V. Scott to officially recognize the true identity of the girl. However, questions of whether she had committed suicide or was racing to catch the train lingered. Also, her purpose of visiting Willoughby still unknown.